My name is Rich Arstead. I'm the Senior Manuscript Archivist at the Montana Historical Society. We are looking at the John Pat Blinn collection. This is a donation that we received several years ago from a family in Montana, and they are letters that Blinn wrote to his girlfriend Betty Ann Gaston during his time in the United States Marine Corps during World War II, and then again when he served in Korea. There are a few letters from her to him. Those don't show up until the end of the collection once he's in Korea. So the bulk of the correspondence is his writings to her as he's serving overseas. And he joined the U.S. Marine Corps in Butte in 1943, just before his 18th birthday. He was born in Anaconda and raised in the Whitehall, Butte area. He and Betty Ann were childhood sweethearts. They went to grade school together, and he started writing to her from a fairly early age, notes in school and that type of thing. This is an impressive collection because of the scope of it. The correspondence starts in 1943 with him informing her that he's enlisted in the Marine Corps and that he'll be shipping overseas. And one of the interesting things that we discovered as the collection was being processed, one of my colleagues discovered that the stamps on the envelopes, 99% of the time, were turned upside down. And so she assumed that that was some sort of symbolism, and so she looked it up and discovered that if the stamp was put on an envelope upside down, that meant that the letter was going to somebody that you love. And so it's a love story, essentially, about these two young Montanans. Betty Ann is about the same age that he is, and so while he's overseas fighting in the Pacific during World War II, and then again in Korea, she's essentially doing what a person normally her age would do. She's going to college, she's getting her degree, she's finding work, and those types of things. And so, as I said, it's kind of a love story. The interesting thing about it is the letters start in 1943. They're very consistent through about 1947, and then there's a gap. And then the letters pick up again in late 48, 49, and then into the 50s. The assumption is that they broke up for a while. And you definitely get that impression. The nice thing about his letters, too, are that they start in 43. And so the letters that you're reading, you can tell are written by a teenager. I mean, even though he's doing very serious things in the Marine Corps, you can still tell by the writings that he's a teenager. He served in a artillery unit during World War II. So he wasn't necessarily right on the front lines in the heaviest part of the fighting, but artillery units were under fire as well, and so the wars are very different for him in that respect, and also in the respect of what he's seen already during World War II and what he's seeing when he gets shipped off to Korea. I think one of the more impressive letters to me is the one that he writes her from Iwo Jima in February of 1945. And he's talking about sitting on the edge of his foxhole, listening to the guns bang away in the distance. And he's trying to get his pipe lit, and he can't get his pipe lit. And he guesses things are tough all over, even on Iwo Jima. And when you read a little bit of the history about the Battle of Iwo Jima, you realize what a horrific battle it was, and the amount of casualties and so forth. And he's coolly, calmly, collectively writing this letter. The penmanship doesn't change at all you couldn't really tell from the penmanship that he's in a combat zone or anything like that. It's just a day in the life of a Marine during World War II, and it's pretty impressive. When he gets home from the war, you kind of expect them to come together and get married, because he writes her almost daily, and sometimes more than once a day. And so the assumption is that he's going to come back, he's going to get settled, and at some point they're going to get married. And that kind of carries on into 1946, 1947 correspondence. But you notice right away that he's having difficulty settling in. And he talks about re-enlisting in the Marine Corps, He enrolls at Gonzaga University, and then he enrolls at Carroll, and then he enrolls at the University of Montana, and he just can't quite find himself. So you're not sure if you're looking at somebody who is suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, which has been diagnosed now and is widely recognized, or exactly what's going on, but something's going on. And then there's a break in the correspondence, and I guess I should state that the correspondence was kept by Betty Ann. And so when she passed away, her family contacted the Historical Society. They contacted the Blinn family first, and then they contacted the Historical Society and told us that the two families would like us to have these letters. And so that's how they came into the collection. But you're not sure exactly why they're not settling down, but they're not settling down. He's not settling down. They're not getting together. You know, your love story's not coming together like your letters indicated early on. And there's this stray letter that she has in with all of these from a young man in North Carolina who's professing his undying love to her. And you think, well, how dare he? You know, she and Pat are supposed to be together, not this other guy. And then the letters pick up, and he's back in the Marine Corps. And he's writing on Marine Corps stationery. And it's the first part of 1950. Korea is starting to heat up. He knows that he's going to be sent there. He knows that there's going to be a battle and so forth. And so he's writing her from San Francisco, and then he writes her again from Japan. And as they're getting ready to depart from Japan, he's with the 1st Marine Division, which made 2 landings in Korea, one at Incheon, and then several weeks later, one at Woosan. And he writes to her from Japan that he's leaving, but not to worry, he still feels lucky. And you can tell Korea is a very different war for him than World War II was. He is part of a fire team during the Korean conflict, and so he's on the very front of the front lines. He's a sergeant. The other thing to remember is he's 25, and he's considered the old man. He's 25. This is his 2nd war that he's fighting. And he becomes the fire team leader of this small group of men who kind of range out in front of the main troops. And as they push into North Korea and winter descends and so forth, he talks about the cold weather. And this is when you start to see some of her letters to him, because they were returned to her because the Marine Corps couldn't keep up with him and get the mail delivered. So if they couldn't deliver it, they sent it back. And so you begin to see some of the things that she's writing to him. And it becomes apparent when you're reading the correspondence that they've got a plan, and that the marriage that you assumed was going to happen after the conclusion of World War II is back on, and it's going to happen. She talks about the fact that she needs to contact the Marine Corps headquarters and inform them that, you know, they have a certain date set aside in 1951, and they have to make sure that he's not late for that date. And at one point, he writes a letter to her, and he basically apologizes for the mistakes that he's made over the last few years. And so, you know, the reconciliation is there, and the bond is still there. They're still very much connected. And as I said, it's a very different war. World War II, all the letters, or the majority of the letters, are written on U.S. Marine Corps stationery. In Korea, once he leaves Japan, that's not the case. And in a couple of instances, the letters that we have from him to her are her letters that he took and wrote on the reverse side of. He even went so far as to take her envelopes, in some instances, and take them apart and lay them out and write on the insides of those so he would have extra stationery. And she responds to him that she's going to make sure that she starts putting extra envelopes and paper in her mailings to him so that he has something that he can write on to send back to her. And she also asks if there's anything else that she can send to let him know. And so on his last letter to her, dated in November of 1950, he writes Scotch in several different places because, baby, it's cold outside in Korea during the winter. His last letter to her is dated November 15, 1950. A couple of weeks later, on December 2nd, 1950, his team is sent to clear a hilltop near the Cheongjin Reservoir in North Korea. And in the process of doing that, he's killed in action. Now, the Chinese have jumped across the Yalu River and have hit the American forces that are in North Korea, and they're pushing them back very rapidly south of the 38th parallel. and as such, they're unable to recover his body. And so his remains actually still are on foreign soil in North Korea somewhere. And he's killed in action, and Betty Ann is notified of his death. And you see some condolence letters from the family talking about how sorry they are about his passing and so forth. But you know, her story goes on, and you know, that's one of the things that we don't have a record of. But what we were able to find out is that a few years later she married. She married a military man, and I believe he was an officer in the Air Force. And they ended up living in the Miles City area, and she died in the 2000s, and that's when the correspondence came to us. And I guess that's one of the things that makes this collection probably so unique and so special. Besides the fact that it's from a young Montana man who served in 2 wars for our country, the fact that all that we really physically have of John Pat Blinn are in the letters that he wrote to Betty Ann in this collection. And so that gives them a special resonance, in my opinion, that the fact that we hold these in trust for him, for his family, and for other Montanans, so that we don't forget this young man and the sacrifices that he made for our country. So the interesting thing about this is that Betty Ann kept all of the letters that she had from him during the war, as well as the few that she got back when he was in Korea. And she kept them. And Pat became a part of her family when she moved on in her life. Her children and her husband were aware of the relationship that she had with this young man and how special he was and how important he was, not just to them, but how important he was and his story was to all Montanans. This is one of the reasons that they sent the letter here to the Historical Society, because once we have them in the collection, we catalog them. We do a box folder level inventory of the collection so that people can go online and see the range of the correspondence, the date ranges of the correspondence, and those types of things that we have here. And we hold these in trust, not to be kept isolated away from the public, but to make them available to the public, because anybody that can come here to the Historical Society and view these letters, all they have to do is go to the reference room and request his papers, and we will bring the papers up to them, and they can actually leaf through and read his letters that he wrote to Betty Ann, the entire range of them if they choose to. And I think that's another thing that's extremely special about this collection, was the fact that the 2 families were willing to share this with everybody. And since the collection has been processed and the inventory went online, there have been a number of instances where people have contacted us from as far away as the eastern part of the United States requesting copies of his letters and so forth, because they have that kind of impact, they have that kind of hold on people, and they tell a story that a lot of times we don't get to hear, we don't get to see, we don't get to read, we don't get to touch. And you get to do all of that with this collection.